My name is Sarah Joy Pond from conveners.org. Our one sentence mission is to help get the right people in the right rooms, having the right conversations to change the world. And our team has had the privilege and pleasure of serving as the Secretariat for the Regenerative Crisis Response Committee, a truly remarkable group of economists, lawyers, historians, and thinkers, many of whom are former regulators themselves, who've come together with the mandate to identify, compare, and recommend changes in fiscal, monetary, and financial regulatory policies that are likely to enable the United States to achieve net carbon neutrality before 2050. One of the topics the committee has been engaging deeply around the past several months is exploring the role that GSEs, FHFA, and other policy players in the mortgage finance market could have in accelerating the energy transition. And now we're pleased to share with you this conversation on the topic between Sarah Bloom Raskin, Adam Tooze, and Stephanie Kelton. We hope you enjoy it. So let's start off by getting a sense from each of you about what convinced you that this mortgage finance market and area was worth focusing on when it comes to accelerating the climate transition.
Well, I'll start just by saying, housing is a huge component of aggregate demand. It's a huge component of growth in our economy. It also has the sense that people use it. And so it becomes a means by which you are grappling directly with climate in its different manifestations, not just in terms of purchasing a house, but of course, living in a house and also in many cases having to rebuild a house in light of a climate event or disaster. So it touches people in a very significant way, and it touches the economy in a huge way.
For me, the idea was that this is an area in which the government, by way of the government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, is already deeply involved in the business of finance. Effectively, a very large part, the backbone of the US mortgage market is sustained by that backstop provided by the federal government. And that has been the case ever since the 1930s. And we know that it's a very powerful lever, both good and for ill, in shaping American society and the distribution of wealth, who has access to this kind of credit and who doesn't. And we know in the past that, say, Black Americans were excluded from mortgage finance. But this is a way in which America shaped a particular model of what's now called simply the conforming mortgage or the standard house and its terms. And so if what we're trying to envision 30 years from now is a housing stock that is compatible with net zero, that's compatible with Paris, then what we need to do is to rethink that model. And the idea should simply be that every mortgage 30 years from now is a green mortgage, a clean mortgage, a mortgage that allows a family to live in comfort and with affordable utility bills and with zero emissions. And we already have the levers and the institutions already in place. And indeed, the entire chain from mortgage agents, from banks, all the way through to securitization, and then ultimately the Fed backstop, that entire chain is already in place.
Yeah, and I think, safeguarding properties, right? Your home is where you build a family, it's where you live, it's what you occupy, but it's also, as a house, the primary source of wealth building for most Americans in their lifetimes. And to the extent that we can do something to help safeguard that wealth building through time by moving toward policies like the ones that we're talking about to help ensure that people have properties that are climate resilient. And, we've all seen the images. We know that people's homes are being swept away by floods and by fires and ravaged in various ways because of climate change. And in many cases, these people will not be made whole, right? They're going to lose everything. I find that compelling.
I want to just say one other thing. Agreeing both with Stephanie and Adam, we have the ability to make these choices now. To Adam's point, we do have these GSEs that are set up. We have Fannie Mae, we have Freddie Mac, we have a definition of a conforming mortgage. We know what they are buying. We know essentially the terms that they are requiring mortgage lenders to underwrite. So that apparatus is in place. And the question is this apparatus with those current settings, the correct settings? And so we have the ability actually to change what those settings are. I think that's pretty powerful.
There's also something rather compelling, I think, about the timeline. If the standard mortgage is a 30-year lifespan, that is the timeline on which we're currently operating. That takes you to 2050. And that's the point at which we know we have to reach net zero if we're going to fulfill the Paris pledges. And so the mortgages that are being contracted now fall within the span of this huge epic transition that we have to go through. And to be contracting them now without that in view is essentially to be missing the boat. They're not actually already envisioning the place where we need to get. We're not being the change that we want to see in the world.
Adam, both you and Sarah have mentioned that this chain already exists, that the settings are there and just need to be tweaked. Let's talk a little bit more about that and kind of explore some of the steps in that process and what would need to change.
Well, I would probably start with the definition of a conforming mortgage, because a conforming mortgage, to the extent it is defined as having particular features, gets a huge advantage, because that is the mortgage that essentially Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are signaling they are going to be buying, and they are huge buyers. As a result, these are the mortgages that typically get written. Okay, well, are they the mortgages that we really need to meet the goals set out in 2050? That's an open question. And I think that question has to get probed a little bit. And then when the answers to that question are created, you have to then adapt the definition of what a conforming mortgage is. And then use that definition to send the signal that this is what Fannie and Freddie are going to be purchasing. When that signal is made, then that is, in essence, what mortgage lenders will start to offer.
It will require us to think hard about how real estate agents position houses, how properties are valued at, as it were, the local level. And on the other hand, at the very other end of this scale, we know already that there is considerable global interest in securitized assets with a green label on them. There is global demand from investors, from insurance funds, from pension funds all around the world. That was one of the mechanisms which Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in their securitization strategies from the 80s onwards were designed to exploit. So that opportunity is there in the current moment. There is huge demand for those kind of assets. And in a sense, it's a question of building the pipeline to deliver them.
I think in the midst of this too, there needs to also be an understanding of the accounting treatment of the conforming mortgage and the components to it. And that, I sense, hasn't really been addressed yet. Any valuation is going to depend on the accounting treatment of them and pace at which they are depreciating. I think that needs some attention.
So forward looking, not valuing current property. Yeah.
So when it comes to solving some of those technical challenges, I know we've talked a lot about the role that the FHFA will play. What is it that we need them to do?
They are one of the agencies that can provide Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac with the incentives. It could be what they did with multifamily homes, where they exempted green mortgages from the cap that the GSEs were operating under. And that gave the GSEs an incentive to grow that business because it was a relatively unregulated part. But it could go to something as simple as the performance metrics by which the leadership of the GSEs are judged. There is a dashboard of criteria that is used and applied to them, and increasing the green share is something that the regulators can, as it were, specify as a performance metric. This is, to me, the sense in which we need to get buy-in. We need to enroll people in understanding this as part of their career and their professional track, and where they just demonstrate their excellence, their commitment, their innovativeness as leaders in this business.
It has to come from the FHFA. They are the overseer, the regulator to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They also, I should say, they sit on the FSOC. So they have an important role to play there, because the FSOC, as we know, is going to be making recommendations regarding the president's executive order regarding different measures that the regulators should be taking. FHFA needs to pull out some of the stops that Adam's talking about, but essentially really dig into their toolbox to kind of see everything that they are capable of doing. And they should be presenting that at the FSOC meetings and be able to, let the FSOC kind of sift through which is more practical or less practical, which should be done on a faster timeline versus a slower timeline. But FHFA has quite a bit of ability here to help shape this.
Because the FSOC, which is the Financial Stability Oversight Council, they have an interest in this because there are risks buried in these assets, right?
That's right. That's right. That's right.
And there is reason to fear that the GSEs are in fact absorbing a substantial part of that risk in the current setting. But the public and the taxpayer ultimately who backstops them needs to be clear about what that distribution of risks is, which is why this is also a financial stability conversation that has to be had at the highest level. We need to actually comprehensively reevaluate who is holding which assets and which liabilities and which risks, and who ultimately ends up carrying them on their balance sheet. And that's why a body like FSOC is absolutely the right place to be assessing this.
You know, different regulators, I think, are going to come into these questions from their own particular mandates. And some of those mandates have to do with safety and soundness. Some of the mandates have to do with disclosure. Some of the mandates have to do with financial stability. And as they put that prism onto the whole set of housing related assets, I think start to build a comprehensive set of approaches that begin to look at the value of our current set of mortgages, but essentially also where we have to go.
But this does need to get pretty granular, because in the end, we are going to have to mobilize, as it were, state level regulation of energy efficiency, the way in which real estate agents operate around the country, the priority they give to these kind of concerns. That's on the one side a huge challenge, and on the other side, the opportunity of this. As you drive this, you drive a large slice of American society towards taking seriously the fact that we have to embark on this transition. These folks are influential people in their communities. Like, if you can move the real estate agents of the United States towards taking climate change seriously, you've won half the battle. And that has to percolate down. I mean, it has to be working in every community, in every city, and ultimately in every state across the United States.
So one of the concepts that's come through in our committee discussions is this idea of bringing safety forward as kind of a reframe of mitigating risk. And it sounds to me like green mortgages and the reframing of the definition of what a safe and secure mortgage is part of that process.
You mean my personal experience as a home buyer and being someone who's just acutely sensitive to issues of climate change and how that factored in to the home buying decision when we made the move from the Midwest out to New York. You know that there are these websites out there where you can put your zip code in and you can, do a forward look and say, what does the landscape here look like at 1.5 degrees? What does it look like at 2 or 2.5? And for me, I did those. I punched in the numbers. I wanted to know what would be the implications of investing, significant amount of money in a property that I may not be able to get out from under when the time comes. And that's a legitimate question, and one that I think increasingly people are starting to factor in. So we're talking about, mortgages where you've got unease and uncertainty for both the homeowner that has made this investment and ultimately one day will want to get out from under it, and the home buyer who's making the forward-looking projection, if I'm going to be in this home for 30 years in a 30-year conventional, will anyone want it on the other side?
Yeah, this is when this gets real, right? Is when people get in the habit of asking that question. Like they ask about school districts. When you buy a house in the US, you habitually inquire, even if you don't have kids, you know perfectly well that in the chain that you might be in at some point, that's going to be a crucial concern for a family that might be interested in buying the home. And so when we can socialize the fact that people ask that question, like, what kind of risk am I exposed to in a climate scenario of X? We won the battle. I mean, at that point, everyone really gets it. And then you adapt however you do it. It's not just institutional change. It is a politics in the same way as the New Deal project was a politics. It was saying to blue collar workers, you too can have a home. And it'll have the following spec, and you can have that home because you can have a safe mortgage over 30 years, and you're not going to get driven out of your home by a spike in interest rates and the need to remortgage. So now start envisioning what your life's going to be like in that scenario. And that was the entire project of the government-backed mortgage system in the United States. It built suburbia. And in a sense, what we need to do is re-engineer that and redirect it in this other direction. And that requires, exactly as Stephanie's saying, homeowners to do the math. Because that's where the energy comes from. When they're doing the math, when they make the demand, I want to know how safe this thing is and whether this will conform. And is there going to be some regulation in 15 years' time that will make this thing unaffordable? That's as it were, the spirit that we need to engender in the entire system.
So in a sense, that's all well and good if you're wealthy and white. we know really well that the climate risk in this country is disproportionately falling to underprivileged, minority, and disenfranchised communities. So what do green mortgages look like if your community is in a high-risk area? What do they look like if you don't have the resources to leave that kind of area? How do we deal with those equity considerations?
Well, turning a blind eye to them isn't going to help, right? Which is effectively what we're doing right now. So that's why we need the audit. That's why we need the stock take. That's why we need to be clear and explicit about what those costs are and what the plan is, what the exit plan is, or the adaptation plan is precisely for those communities. Because they're also, as we saw in 2008, the households that can least afford the hit to their household equity. That's where you see people really being zeroed out by the perfectly rational decision they've made to put their, all their eggs in this basket and to try and make a go of it. They're precisely following the promise of the American dream, and then they're the people that get wiped out. So obviously, pretending that this problem is not there because exposing it would, as it were, expose this inequity is not a way to go. The way to move forward with this is to do a stock take, to do an audit, and to face these distributional issues head on, because otherwise, what we're headed towards is climate injustice.
I think we're going to have to build millions and millions of units of affordable, resilient housing, and people are going to relocate. I think that there's just no way around that. We're going to have to help people transition out of places that are not climate friendly. And that's going to include getting creative about employment opportunities and what do we do with jobs and how do you allow for that? This is a huge rethink.
And the sooner we do this, the smaller will be the sunk costs. I mean, the sunk costs are already pretty painful. But if we allow another 10, 20 years of heavy development in the Delta or, in the Panhandle in Florida, then we are basically asking for a gigantic problem a generation from now. So that's where the irresponsibility is, continuing with the status quo without frankly facing what the risks are and their maldistribution and the way in which they compound evident and huge inequalities in American society at the moment. I mean, that's the irresponsible way to act. The responsible thing is exactly as Stephanie says, is to identify where the risks are and begin to think about the off-ramp, how we begin to move towards a much more sustainable situation. And I agree, I don't see any alternative to presumably publicly funded or publicly backed program for the construction of high quality homes for American families.
Yeah, I think ultimately the equity concerns have to be wedded into the climate concerns. They cannot be done separately because if they do, this is going to achieve nothing. We have to figure out a way in which the equity concerns get woven in, and great risk and great peril if we fail at that.
How does refinancing fit into this? And do we do about greening the stock of real estate in the US?
Yeah, because there are two dimensions to this problem. Right? One is new construction and ensuring that the new buildings meet high standards. And there are already leaders in this field. If you talk to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they can tell you who the leading firms are who are trying to get ahead. And that's crucial because they set a high bar for everyone that's following. Mm-hmm. But the majority of property, obviously, is already in existence. And the question is, how do we upgrade it? And this is where I think refinancing offers a really powerful lever, because every time interest rates move in the United States, you get this huge wave of refinancing. And if you can tie that to new standards, improved standards, I mean, obviously you don't want to penalize people in ways that they didn't anticipate if their houses don't meet standards, but you need to offer at that moment incentives to say, right, okay, you could refinance at X rate if you status quo, but at this much better rate if you're willing to make the investments to improve the energy efficiency of your home, and we can add a little bit to the size of the mortgage so that you can finance that. That's the way to go. And it's a very powerful lever.
Yeah, I would say, Adam talks about incentives. I mean, these incentives have to be accessible across the board. I mean, one of the current frustrations, I think right now, is that if you want to get solar panels, you want to get a certain kind of HVAC system that runs on a certain kind of renewable battery. That is a privilege that is really only accessible to few people. And that's going to have to change if we're, in essence, going to bring about a true, across the board, equally distributed kind of change at both the financing point and the refinancing point. And I think there's work to be done there because the accessibility is not evenly distributed.
It needs to become a standard, right? And so that's why we need to be working. This is another one of the ripple effects. The HVAC business needs to be in a position to basically offer modular retrofits, which enormously increase the efficiency of the units they apply and then open them to potential renewable energy sources. There are a whole variety of very good technical options already, which in many parts of the US are already extremely efficient. But as Sarah says, they need to be just standard options, tick a box. I'd like it with more fries. I'd like this with more solar. Thank you very much. So that
and easy, like really easy. You know what I mean? Like you don't have to go through, multiple steps in order to make this happen. It has to be easy.
Not bespoke, not boutique, but just the standard fix. And a lot of the drive has got to come from the utilities here, right? The idea that solar is, as it were, basically something you stick on your own roof, not the scale that we need to be thinking in terms of. Sure, that helps, and there's no reason why you shouldn't. And for big applications, in particular locations, it makes perfect sense. But broadly speaking, the utilities all need to move to clean energy. And the crucial thing to do with homes is heat pumps and insulation so that they become as neutral as possible and as efficient as possible. And the real payback from that is their utility bills go down. So they become much more affordable places to live in, both in the summer, and those are going to get more and more hot, and we're going to have more and more air conditioning needs, and in the winter. So that, I think, is critical. We don't need to be thinking of this as a home by home sort of suburban type solution. It has to be infrastructural to a very considerable extent.
I would say, I'll throw this out because this is the way I think, but for very low income families, they can barely afford the mortgages that they have, much less, if you say, well, we'll give you very good rates and we'll add it to the back end of the mortgage, they're not going to take it up. I would rather see something arrive in the mailbox that says, on Thursday, October 17th or whatever, we will be in your area installing solar panels. Check this box if you do not want us to show up and put solar panels on your home. Like when you upgrade your utilities, you didn't pay for that. It just, it just appeared one day. I think we have to think bigger and bolder about, some of the kinds of investments that are going to have to be undertaken on the public purse.
Be honest, rather than thinking of this mass of technical issues as a sort of obstacle, something that stands in the way of us and a solution, I think we should think of this as it were, the challenge. This is the mission. This is what we need to be doing. And the fact that we can, as it were, envision where we need to end up, we need to totally rejig what the conforming mortgage is and reorientate this entire system around it. It gives us something to bite on, right? It gives us a project to work on collectively. And that's crucially what America needs right now in climate politics. It needs momentum, and you build momentum by engaging as many key interest groups as possible in a project that then sustains across administrations, across decades. And that, to me, is one of the things that's attractive about this. American real estate is one of the single largest asset classes in the entire world, and we need to reshape it over the coming decades. There's a lot of money to be made in doing that. There's a lot of careers to be made in doing that. And in a sense, that's the sort of energy that we need to mobilize around this series of technical questions at every stage. And they could be, as it were, the killer objection, but I think far better, these are the challenges that will define an entire generation of people thinking about this problem. But we need to set the right signals, and then, by all means, let's let the market do its work with the right incentives to drive this along, so that this then goes by itself, because that's the sort of social system, that's the kind of institution that's resilient. You could sort of be staggered by it and go, oh my God, how on earth are we going to figure this out? There's so many different stages. Flip that on its head and say, think about all the people who could be enrolled in making this system go and making it go in the right direction if we can get this right.
Thanks again for joining us, and please reach out with any follow-up questions.